Welcome to QuickSWP's online video series. In this video, we'll discuss onboarding and staff training for QuickSWP's field technicians. In this section, we're going to be discussing what SWP is, what projects it applies to, and all of the information and the background information that goes along with creating a SWP and making a SWP official with the State Water Board. So one thing that is very frustrating to me, I have a background in civil engineering. I had a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, did have some emphasis in environmental engineering as well. And one thing that's really annoying to me, I don't understand it, but I don't remember a single mention of SWP when I was in school. No one brought it up. No one talked about it. I went and got my EIT, or your FE exam, as some of you guys might know. Not a single question about SWP. Furthermore, I went and got my professional engineering exam. That means you're a professional engineer in the state of California. Not a single question about SWP. I didn't get my master's or my PhD. I know some people that did, and I ask them all the time, anything come up about SWP? Do you guys know why SWP is important? Any knowledge gained in school from SWP? And the answer is almost always unequivocally no. It's a little frustrating, but there is a whole industry in construction related to SWP. It is vital part of a construction project over an acre, and most large construction firms deal with projects over an acre. And again, it's a law. It's not something that you can pick and choose to do. If you don't do it, you absolutely get fined, and the fines are very hefty. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars a day if you're out of compliance. So it's something that annoys me. I try to do my best to educate the new generation that's coming up in the construction industry. So I'm going to start off very high-end, high-level. The SWP permit was something that got handed down. I'm going to dummy it down. There's a lot of details, but in general, it was handed down by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. So the EPA came along and said, hey, we need to mitigate and prevent pollution from construction sites getting into our receiving water bodies and getting off-site. So the EPA started the process. It went through a few different layers, as typical government programs do. And what it ended up with is what's called the Construction General Permit, which is shortened to the CGP. So the Construction General Permit is the permit that dictates and governs all SWP-related activities in California. From the top, what is SWP? You hear that acronym, SWP. It's in the name of the company, QuickSWP. There's also different ways to say it. On the design side of things, engineers, architects, they like to say SWP. Contractors, people in the field, developers like to use SWPPP. It is the same thing. It means the same thing. It's just, for whatever reason, these two different disciplines or entities like to call it different things. SWPP stands for, it's an acronym, so it stands for Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. So it's an important thing to remember, because a lot of times people ask you that. Well, what does SWPP stand for? Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. Projects that apply to SWPP. So you might be wondering, what does QuickSWP do? What kind of projects does QuickSWP work on? So it doesn't matter if it's an industrial site, a school site, commercial, residential, skyscraper. The one overarching requirement for SWPP in California is if the project disturbs over 1 acre or not. Now, that 1 acre could be, it also includes the staging area. So if it's just shy of 1 acre of construction, but they have a laydown area where they have their materials, or they have a staging area, all of that, when you add up all the square footage, if that is 1 acre or more, we must apply for this permit. And it is by law, so it's not an option. It is a requirement by law, and there are state inspectors that come by to check to see if we're doing it properly. There's local inspectors that come by to see if we're doing it properly. The overarching requirement is the project has to be disturbing at least 1 acre of land. So the topic of who has to get the permit comes up. The permit is issued to the legally responsible person for the project, and that's typically the owner of the project or the developer of the project. And a lot of times they will hire QuickSWIP to obtain the permit, get the permit for them. And that's something that we do here in the office. That's not typically something the QSP is responsible for doing. Talking about acronyms, we'll start with LRP. LRP is the legally responsible person for the project. That is the person whose name goes on the permit, the SWPPP permit, and who has to ultimately be responsible for all action on site relating to the SWPPP. The next acronym is QSP. The QSP is really who this training is for. And the QSP stands for Qualified SWPPP Practitioner. The Qualified SWPPP Practitioner is responsible for visiting construction sites, interacting with the site client on the site superintendent, whoever that may be, to provide recommendations, to make sure the project is in compliance with SWPPP, viewing all their construction activities. If there's any best management practices they recommend, it's their responsibility to put those in the reports and submit them to the client. Another acronym is BMP, or Best Management Practice. You'll hear BMP thrown around quite a bit in this industry. And a BMP simply is all of the items that a QSP needs to look out for and recommend mitigation for. It's called a Best Management Practice. It's how you manage maybe a not ideal scenario, or in a scenario where there is a chance for pollution to get offsite or a chance for sediment to get offsite. So that's what a BMP is. Another acronym that we're going to discuss is the QSD. Now it's very similar to the QSP, except the D stands for developer. So Qualified SWPPP Developer. The Qualified SWPPP Developer is the person who creates the SWPPP. And the SWPPP is a binder. It's generally about 3 inches thick. There's a lot of boilerplate information in there, so it doesn't really change from project to project, but there is project-specific BMP information in that binder, and only a QSD can create that. QuickSWIP does have QSDs on staff, and oftentimes we do create the SWPPP binder. But as a QSP, that would not be your responsibility. So when a project is about to start, the process to get that project going is called an NOI, or a Notice of Intent. That is all done in a system, an online database system called SMARTS. And again, SMARTS is another acronym. It stands for Stormwater Multiple Application Report Tracking System. That's not something you necessarily need to memorize, although I have been asked what SMARTS stands for many times on site, because people are always curious. Well, what does SMARTS stand for? What is this database? Why is it called SMARTS? So an NOI needs to be applied for through SMARTS. Going through that whole process of the NOI, ultimately the LRP or the project receives what's called a WDID number. The WDID number is the permit number, and it stands for Waste Discharge ID number. And what you'll hear often is, did we get our WDID? Did we get our WDID? Because that's ultimately what matters. That's the permit. That's the construction general permit in hand. And that's when you know the project is officially registered with the State Water Board, and you can start moving dirt according to State Water Board. Now there's typically dozens and dozens of permits before you can actually break ground, but that's just one of them. So it is very important when you are on site conducting these QSP inspections that you don't just go through the motions. And that is something that can very easily happen. You go to a site, you're visiting, multiple sites in a day, and might think it's becoming a little mundane, Oh, they haven't really changed much from this week to the next week. Oh, there's some tracking right there. Don't really need to focus too much on that. Oh, yeah, they have a little spill from the paint canister. Not too big of a deal. I don't need to necessarily show that in the report. Now, there's two ways to tackle this. And one is you should never ignore a BMP or something you see visually on site that is not in compliance. There are two different ways to tackle that. And if it's something small, for example, there's some trash that's overflown from the trash bin. If it's something that you can tell the site superintendent right then and there, perfect, because typically they like to take care of it right then and there. And typically what happens is you don't have to put that in the report, but it did get accomplished. The whatever observation you were looking at that was out of compliance now quickly is in compliance, and you don't have to mention that in the report. Now there's other items, for example, a construction entrance that is just inadequate. It requires a whole new layer of rock, and it's not going to be able to quickly be fixed. Now, something like that, you absolutely want to put in the report. If you can communicate that to your site superintendent, even better. But you never want to ignore things. And I'll tell you why you never want to ignore things. Because you might think that no one's looking at the site, there's no inspectors coming by. But as the QSP, our job, our role, and our responsibility is to keep our clients protected from what I call the real bad guys. And the real bad guys start at the state level. This is a state permit. The construction general permit is a state permit. And there are state inspectors who randomly visit sites. Typically, they get tipped off if a site is not in compliance, and they'll make a visit. And when they make a visit, I've never seen a state inspector come by a site and not mention something. So that little thing that you thought you can just ignore, that stockpile that wasn't covered before a rain event, the state inspector will cite the LRP, and guess what's going to happen? The first phone call is going to come right back to QuickSWIP, because our whole role and responsibility is to make sure that we keep them in compliance. So I'll tell you what, it's a great feeling. This validates our work when we see something, we put it in the reports. Sometimes the contractor doesn't get around to doing it. Maybe he doesn't think it's that important. But maybe a few weeks later, a state inspector comes by and says, the exact same things that we put in the reports, the state inspector is calling them out on it for. So when they match up, when the state inspector's report matches up with QuickSWIP's QSP report, it's a great feeling, because what we say very politely right back to our client is, we have noticed this exact thing, and if you look back 3 weeks ago, we stated this exact same thing. And it just validates our work. It makes us look great. It makes the client understand that we see things before the state inspectors or the local inspectors see it, and it gives them trust to want to work with us in the future. So I'm going to circle back, and something that might have been a little confusing when I speaking about what you should and shouldn't put on the QSP report when you go out and visit a site. I didn't want QSPs going out on site ignoring anything. When I say ignoring anything, I mean if you see something out of compliance, make sure you either A, tell the site superintendent right then and there, or B, put it in the report. Now, if you tell the site superintendent, you feel like maybe he or she is being dismissive, doesn't really care, whatever, then I say put it in the report. If it's something small, let me give you an example of something small. Maybe a gas canister, a refueling canister, typically supposed to be within secondary containment. If it's just sitting on the ground, okay, not the end of the world. Maybe someone's using that thing. Maybe you can go by and tell the site superintendent, hey, at the end of the day, Can you just make sure all fuel canisters are taken out? That's an example of something small. You did your job, you told somebody. Something larger could be you have a discussion with the site superintendent, you tell him about that gas canister. Next time you're out there, there's 4 or 5 gas canisters. Maybe one of them has nothing underneath it and you can see a little leakage going on and you see the fuel on the ground. Then you immediately put it in the report. So the whole purpose of this job as a QSP is to protect the client. That client is who we're servicing so they do not get fined. But at the same time, you really want to protect QuickSWIP as well. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you want to make sure that we're covering our side by documenting all of the observations that are inadequate or out of compliance on site. So in case anybody comes back and says, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you put this in the report? We have documentation that we did. So I mentioned previously an acronym called SMARTS. It's not something that a QSP needs to know inside and out, but it is something that you should be aware of and understand what it is. Again, it is an online database put together by the State Water Board, which governs this permit. The construction general permit is all done via the State Water Board on this online system called SMARTS. And within that online database is all project information relevant to SWIP. Again, you're not going to necessarily have to go into SMARTS and do any work in SMARTS. That's something that the QSDs typically do within QuickSWIP and in the industry as a whole. But it is something to be aware of. And that is where all information related to the site, including receiving water bodies, risk level, construction duration, how you open up a project, how you close out a project. There's annual reports associated with every single project we do with the California Water Board. So there's all these steps that have to happen kind of in the background. So there's a couple items related to the project that have to be done in collaboration with the QSP. For example, the annual report, there's a bunch of questions asking about observations on the site, what the QSP saw on site, who the QSP was. So the QSP and the QSD or whoever is managing the SMARTS have to be working as a team to kind of get that portion of the project done. And at the very end, there's what's called an NOT. That's called a Notice of Termination, or sorry, the acronym for that is a Notice of Termination. And that is where the QSP goes around the entire site taking pictures to prove to the water board that this project is indeed complete. There's no chance for additional pollutants to get off site from construction, and the water board eventually reviews those pictures and accesses approval of the NOT. So there is some teamwork that goes along with whoever's out in the field versus whoever is managing SMARTS. I'm going to segue into why SWIP is important and what the number one common pollutant is on a construction site. Does anybody know? Anybody? No? Okay. All right.
Water.
Incorrect.
Mud.
Much closer. So one thing that people, it might not jump out at you right away, but sediment leaving a construction site is the number one pollutant to the environment. Sediment is, I guess, just a fancy word for dirt. It's ground up organic matter, I guess you could say. When that mixes with stormwater, it allows a way for that sediment to get off site. People think, what's the big deal? Dirt leaving a site? Well, it's not a big deal in small quantities. It's a natural part of erosion. Rivers and streams erode banks over time and sediment flows downriver. The issue is during construction sites, it happens in massive, massive quantities. And think about how many construction sites, for example, right now in the Bay Area are going on. This video is made in 2020. Thousands of construction projects are going on in the Bay Area. Everything's draining into the creeks, rivers, and streams in the Bay Area. That is a lot of sediment going into the bay if it goes unmitigated. I'll tell you again, why is sediment important for leaving the site? Why is it important to mitigate sediment? There's a number of reasons. Number one, sediment leaving your site eventually goes into, well, depends on what path it takes, but it could take the path of going into local storm drains. What happens when it goes into the city storm drain or the county storm drain? It builds up. Builds up. It causes a maintenance issue for whatever entity owns that storm drain system, because they have to go in there, flush out the pipes because they're losing capacity, right? Imagine if you have a pipe, half of it is filled with sediment. Now all of a sudden you don't have that full pipe capacity. You have half of that. What does that cause? Flooding. You get a big storm event. Now water can't go down into the drains and you start flooding roadways and people have a hard time getting around town. Another big issue with sediment is, imagine a creek or river, kind of like in a V, and water's flowing in and out, right? Kind of like a cross section. So as sediment builds up in this creek, river, stream, all of a sudden it's building up. The capacity you had at this area all of a sudden is lessened. So what does that mean? That same water that wants to flow through this stream all of a sudden doesn't have the capacity it used to have, has much less. So what happens to that stormwater? Has to go somewhere, so it goes over the banks. And that's what's called overland flooding. Another really bad thing about sediment is when it does eventually go into the creeks, rivers, and streams, it causes what's called turbid water or cloudy water. Think about sediment mixed with water, it becomes really cloudy. So what happens is the sunlight that tries to go through the water to reach the plants at the bottom of these creeks, rivers, and streams all of a sudden can't get to those plants. Those plants can't photosynthesize the sunlight. So once plants can't photosynthesize, the microorganisms and the wildlife that eat those plants all of a sudden lose their food source, and it becomes a trickle-down effect of, it could be catastrophic. It could kill off whole ecosystems and bioorganisms. So those are the main reasons why sediment is so bad and why SWPPP is so important to mitigate the sediment on construction sites. So prior to going out into the field, there is some required reading you'll have to do. Me speaking and giving you information is a part of it, but the other part of it is actually reading, being able to review in your own time 3 things, and they are, well, actually 2 things. The construction general permit. So the construction general permit is 100, I think 200 or 300 pages long. What I've done is I've went in and removed kind of the background information and items that aren't necessary, in my opinion, and dummied it down. I think it's less than 100 pages. So you'd be required to read that document and get a better understanding of the actual permit and requirements. And then there is a BMP handbook, so Best Management Practices Handbook, that really goes into detail for every single BMP that you might encounter on a construction site. Again, that is like 300 something pages. I've dummied that down to the most common BMPs you'll see on a construction site. The ones that come up regardless of what kind of construction site it is, you'll see them. You will be paid for your time for reading the construction general permit and going through the BMP handbook. It is important that you really grasp this knowledge, because at the end of it, there will be a quiz on it. It's not super formal. It's more of a discussion with me. So me or another Quick SWPPP member, to make sure that you actually understand what exactly is going on. Instead of just browsing through it, when you sit down and have a discussion with someone about this topic, pretty quickly you'll be able to, someone who really knows what's going on or someone who has experience like myself or another Quick SWP team member will be able to get a good feeling on whether you are ready to go out in the field or if you still need some guidance and need to review some more material, have further discussions to just ensure that you're comfortable and you know what is required of you and what to look out for. Now, I don't want you to get too overwhelmed when I say there's a quiz and there's all this reading. It's not necessarily that you have to memorize every single line that you read. It is more a quality control check to make sure prior to you going out in the field, interacting with real clients, being on a live construction site, you are aware of the requirements. And it's something that we want to work with you on. You know, if first time we have the discussion, if some things aren't totally clear, we're going to work with you and we'll get to a point where we both feel comfortable going out there, because it's in our interest to get you out in the field as soon as possible doing QSBs. It's in your interest to get out in the field, do your job, be a QSB, but we don't want to do it prematurely. And that's what the whole process of reading and the discussion quiz is all about. We hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.